So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. I am doing a Cash for Keys presentation. My name is Sasha Struthers. I am an attorney here in Los Angeles, and my practice predominantly focuses on tenant buyouts, Cash for Keys. So I'm doing this webinar. I'm going to be recording the webinar. If you don't want to be in the recording, you can block your video. I will later post this video, so if people want to go back to it for reference, they can. So I'm just going to kind of get right into it and share my screen so you can see the presentation. Oh, at the end, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box and I'll address as many as I can. The webinar is about an hour. I probably can get through most people's questions in the hour, but we will do that at the end after the presentation. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to try to see if I can do this in full screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen, my presentation? Okay, great. So as a disclaimer for this presentation, all of this is for general information. None of it is specified or tailored to any one specific situation. By being part of this webinar or asking questions, it's not establishing an attorney-client relationship. And all this is just to keep you informed and to try to explore potential options for you as a landlord in LA City. At the end, when I do the Q&A, if I'm not able to answer fully your question, I invite everybody to go to my website and fill out a contact form, and we can set up a consultation to go over your individual situation. Also on my website, you can sign up for my newsletter if you haven't already done so. I send it out more or less once a week. And I also do have informative videos on my YouTube channel should you want to check those out. And a lot of them are also on Cash for Keys. So today we're going to go over what Cash for Keys are. We're going to talk about the differences between buyouts and relocation. We'll discuss when relocation is required, why buyouts are popular, and some of the buyout requirements. So to get right into it, Cash for Keys is simply a voluntary lease termination agreement. They are typically done in rent-controlled properties, or if you live in the city of Los Angeles, or another jurisdiction that has eviction controls on single-family residences and condos. They're a common way that landlords get properties back to either own or occupy, or rehab them and get market rent, or sell them because it's more appealing to sell typically a vacant unit or a few vacant units, depending. So they're voluntary, meaning that both sides are agreeing to it. They're arm's length negotiations between the landlord and the tenant. Buyout and relocation sometimes are interchangeable terms, but they have actual specific meanings. So a buyout is voluntary. A relocation is mandatory. But why they sometimes get conflated is you have what's called buyout disclosures, which I'll discuss a little bit more at the end. But it's a mandatory paper that the tenant has to receive in a lot of jurisdictions that informs them of their rights and also informs them about what relocation is. Many rent-controlled cities have their own relocation formulas. So sometimes, when the tenants call housing to get general information, if they're presented a buyout, housing will sometimes kind of nudge the tenant to try to get what's called relocation. So in the event you were forced to move out, here's what the city has set aside for you. Now, in a buyout, depending on the jurisdiction, it's typically voluntary, as in the tenant and the landlord can come to an agreement about money. But there are certain jurisdictions that have minimums. LA County has minimums, Santa Monica has minimums, Inglewood has minimums. And so you have to offer in a buyout no less than what relocation is. And all the jurisdictions have pretty much different formulas to how they come up with relocation. Some it's by the time they've been there, some it's by the size of the unit. It's 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, etc. Then there's bumps. Sometimes they have allocations for separate moving expenses. Sometimes the amount is higher if the tenant is, senior, usually 62 or older, if there's a minor child living in the premises, or if the tenant is disabled. So buyout is voluntary, relocation is mandatory, but relocation often is used as kind of a guiding stick on what to offer a tenant in a buyout. So relocation is required in a few different scenarios, which are called no-fault just cause evictions. So the tenant hasn't violated the lease, the tenant has been paying their rent, they're current on it. There's no reason to evict the tenant for the tenant's own fault, but you have a just cause. So I'm going to go over a few of them and kind of the drawbacks of them. So the first and kind of the most popular one is the owner occupancy. So either yourself or a family member plans to occupy the unit. Now, the caveat to an owner occupancy is one, you might not want to owner occupy, especially if you have like an apartment building and you have no intention in living in one of like, let's say 16 units. Another thing is depending on the tenant and the property, sometimes you can't owner occupy the unit you want because it's, you know, the last tenant in would be the first tenant out, LIFO if you're in accounting. So last one in, first one out. Other things is there's typically in jurisdictions a mandatory minimum that you have to occupy the property in order for you to be able to own or occupy. And then you have to file paperwork with a lot of the jurisdictions. You have to pay filing fees. So it doesn't offer a lot of flexibility. If you genuinely want to own or occupy, this is an avenue. But if your life is a little fluid, maybe your son or your daughter needs, you know, to move back home or into the property for a year or two, or they don't really know, you might want to try to do a buyout. That way you have more flexibility to put the market back to rent, put the unit back to market rent. The next one would be if you were to do an approved condominium conversion. Those are possible, but they're also very difficult, especially if you have a rent-controlled property. Condominium conversions are very hard to pull off. Demolition, that's also the Ellis Act in many jurisdictions, and that's if you're going to demolish the property. Typically, if you have a rent-controlled property, if you demolish it, you have to put basically the same number of units. They might be rent controlled unless you strike another deal with the city. It takes time. If you Ellis Act it, tenants have up to like a year to kind of delay the process, depending on, you know, their age and their circumstance. And you might not want to demolish your property, quite frankly. So that's kind of one that's more used for developers, not really landlords who plan to keep their property. And then the Ellis Act, as some people know it, which is like your last resort as a landlord. Like, I don't want to be a landlord anymore. I'm done landlording. The Ellis Act is a last resort because it has a lot of strings attached to it. Depending on your jurisdiction, there's different timelines. LA City has a 2, 5, 10 year. So if you put if they put the units back on to market within 2 years, you could be sued by the city and the tenant. If you put it back online 5 years, the tenant has a right of first refusal and they can get the unit at their same rent plus applicable rent increases. And then after 10 years, I think you're kind of out of the woods on that. So again, the last case scenario, especially if you're trying to sell a property and it's a multifamily property and it's an income property, you take away pretty much all the value of the property by taking it offline. So this is very rarely needed unless one, you're going to develop the property, or two, you genuinely as a family plan to occupy all of these units. And then a government order, which hopefully you don't get one of those, but they're also somewhat tricky to get because the cities are not very hard pressed to order landlords to move tenants out, given the sensitivity about housing right now. So there are agencies, you know, depending on the circumstance, where they'll issue an order for the property to either be demolished and rebuilt or an order for the tenant to vacate. But if you get that kind of order, you're kind of in a little bit more hot water. And substantial remodel. This one gets cracked down a lot in a lot of different rent-controlled cities. A lot of them are not even allowing it. Some of them say you can do it, but the tenant has to opt to permanently move out. So if you're going to be remodeling a whole unit, the chances that the tenant wants to move out are very low. And then some cities don't even allow it as a reason to evict. Why are buyouts popular? Probably because I just went over all those things with you and they all seem like dead ends. Evictions are very expensive. They're very uncertain. We all know that there's plenty of advocates out there for tenants. If you have a disgruntled enough tenant, they'll exercise all of those rights. So the buyout is a way for you and the tenant to come to a meeting of minds and agree they will move out. You will compensate them for that, and you'll be able to get the unit back and do what you want. You can remodel it, put it to market rent. You can sell the property without the tenants. You can move into it if you need to, but you drastically reduce the number of strings attached with this. And above all, you are trying to avoid going to the eviction court with that uncertainty. In my experience, when tenants do buyouts, 99% of the time, the tenants follow through with it. Tenants don't often cancel it, even though they have a right to cancel it, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But for the most part, the tenants, if they come to an agreement, they do honor it, and they abide by the agreement. So that's why it's important that you have a voluntary agreement. You don't want to set yourself up to fail by maybe strong-arming a tenant to something they really don't want to agree to and risk them either canceling it or not moving out, and then you're going down the eviction path. But they're popular because, like I said, most of the time when tenants get into the agreements, they honor them. You get the unit back, you're able to do what you plan to do with the unit, and it's a lot less stressful on you as a property owner. Now here is a little bit of like my pride and joy. It is my buyouts requirement chart. So in this chart, you will see the jurisdictions that have buyout requirements and what some of them are. So some of the requirements, most of the time it's on RSO units. Now, things might change in the future with that, but by and large, buyouts are done on RSO units. A lot of people will argue with me, well, I have a house, but I have to file it. Depending on the jurisdiction, you don't. Like LA City, if you're buying out a tenant in a single family residence, they don't get these kinds of carve outs. They don't get the disclosure. They don't get a cancellation period. It's not a filing requirement. So it's important to know what your property is and where it falls on the chart. Next, all of them, if it is subject to the buyout requirement programs, there is a disclosure the tenant has to get. A lot of the times it has to be bilingual. And the city usually does have them. English and Spanish are the two most common. Next, you run into the cancellation periods. It's between 30 and 45 days. So the tenant can change their mind and back out of it. The agreements have to be bilingual in most jurisdictions. However, if the tenant is predominantly like a Spanish speaker or they speak a different language, I highly recommend having the agreement be bilingual anyways. There's minimums in certain jurisdictions. Like I said, LA County has a minimum, Culver City has a minimum, Santa Monica, and Inglewood. So those are the four that they have minimums. Those minimums are tied to what the city has as their relocation amounts. All of them do have to be filed. Some of them you have to file within a certain period of time. Some you can't file any sooner than a certain period of time. And then lastly, you have to give a copy to the tenant, and some jurisdictions require that you have a proof of service that you've served the tenant with the final buyout agreement. So all in all, it's a pretty brief presentation. So if anyone has any questions, I will open up the floor and do what I can to answer those. Let me see where the chat is. Now I got to figure out how to find the chat. Okay. Okay. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions.
Hi, this is Andre Malikian. I have a question.
Yes.
And you may have discussed this earlier. For LA, I have buildings in LA City. And many of my tenants have been there for over 30 years. I would think your email is what prompted me to think about this, is to start the buyout process with them, because they're probably going to be leaving soon anyway. And I don't know if you mentioned LA City having a minimum requirement based on age or any other reasons for tenants.
No, LA City doesn't have a minimum, but typically there's kind of two schools of thought. If you have a tenant that you think is on their way out, you can offer them what you feel comfortable offering them. but understand that they'll see the relocation chart. So they might counter, hey, I want the max end of the chart, or I want this, or the city says I should get this. So you're free to offer less than what the relocation chart has in LA City, but always kind of budget and anticipate they're either going to come back wanting more, at least the high end of the chart, or where they think they fall on the chart. Or that might not be enough money for them. So it depends on what you feel of the tenant. You think they would take less. A lot of the times you offer tenants relocation or a little bit more than relocation. But for LA City, you could offer less.
And does your office provide the full service of initial contact, negotiating, and filing the paperwork, and et cetera, all the way through?
Yes, my office does from beginning to end.
Okay, and I don't know if you've discussed a price for that. Is it a flat fee on your end? And then we either say yes or no to if the tenant comes back with demanding higher amounts than we would like to pay?
Yeah, so my service is flat fee. So I do it two different ways. If you as the landlord strike a deal with the tenant, you come back to me with the terms and I draft up and I file it, and that's a flat $1,500 per buyout. If you want me to do it beginning to end, it's $3,500 per buyout, basically per unit. It's $500 up front, and then $1,500 when the tenants sign the agreement, and $1,500 when the tenants move out.
Okay, and I heard the last part of most of the time when they sign the agreement, your initial agreement, when we come to a dollar amount agreement, is that when they have the 30 days from your, or 40, was it 45 or 30 days for Los Angeles that they have to rescind?
They have 30 days to rescind from when they sign the agreement.
Okay. And even if they do, your fees due for the whole $3,500, is that accurate?
So my fee is kind of tied to metrics. So it's $500 upfront per unit to get negotiations, because then I have to negotiate. I send the letter out, I do the back and forth. Then it's $1,500 when they sign, and then $1,500 when they move out. So I do have some skin in the game,
Yeah, I got
because
it.
I don't get my last payment if they don't move.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, your email was just poignant. I mean, I've known about this for years. I have lots of friends who've done this, and I never did it myself. And I just thought, wow, this is the right time to do it. I mean,
Yeah,
nobody knows what's going to happen in this election.
this election is going to be, I mean, every election's always wild. So
Yeah, this one's a little
this one,
for us landlords.
Landlords are really a target. I'm not quite sure why, but this ballot measure is insane in my opinion, and it's definitely not going to help small mom and pops. It's not going to help the next generation ever want to be landlords, and it's definitely not going to help the housing crisis. So vote no.
Yeah, well, it's just which may change to voting no means yes or something like that, right? You have to really read it.
Yes, I have to really read it when it comes like closer to, because they have a habit of changing things right before they put it.
Yeah. Okay. And so I have your contact information from your initial email. Is that the best way to reach you? And then is that there? I noticed there was a fee for a 1 hour consultation. If I'd like to start the process with you to do it, is there anything I need to do different, or just say I'd like to start and we meet, or you get the leases?
Yeah.
What's the process?
So you can go to my website. I have a contact form, and it's also, I believe, linked in the newsletter. So you can just send me, you can fill out the contact form, and it'll prompt an inquiry in my software. So then I can start moving it along.
Okay.
And then reach out to you.
Okay. And if I believe I have multiple tenants in one building, and I believe they're family members.
Very common. Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I don't know if that's all common or not common, or
it's common. I mean, we could talk more about your specific situation,
Yeah.
but it's very common that you have families that live in multiple units. I have many clients, and I've done many buyout scenarios.
Yeah, I feel like if one goes, they're all going to go.
Yeah, and they kind of huddle together. But
Right.
the thing with tenants, there's always a school of thought, like, do I offer one at a time? Do I just blanket offer?
Yeah.
And my opinion is just a blanket offer, because what they'll do is they'll band together, they'll come back, they'll say they want all this money. And then you explain, my client doesn't have all this money because they're not Mr. Monopoly. And if you guys want it, here's what the money's allocated for. And then eventually they start to kind of like turn on each other, so to speak. in the
Mhm.
sense that they have to look at what's best for their family. So even though they're families, they have their own individual situations. And so
Right.
in that sense, as much as they band together, and some of them successfully stay together and they negotiate, but I also tell them I can't make money appear that doesn't, my client doesn't have. So if it
Right.
doesn't make sense, I can't strong arm both sides. But there is a budget for this, and this is where we're kind of at. There's maybe wiggle room, but if they start coming like they each want 100,000, then it's not going to make sense. And a lot of
Right.
times that gets hashed out in the negotiation process.
Right. It sounds like, I mean, like I said, it was just such an eye-opening email. I would think that if they drag their feet, this election's working against them too, because if this does pass, then all the buyouts are off the table anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, I give deadlines to tenants. I go, hey, decisions have to be made. You have to move out by this date. This is the offer. You
Right. But if
take
they say
it.
something like, I want to wait until the election, that seems like they're in greater jeopardy because they will have no more option because there's no incentive to buy out after the
Well,
election.
exactly. So there definitely is a time crunch to it. And I just let them know. I go, hey, my client has to make decisions. This is the offer. And, take it. We have meaningful discussions, or if we don't reach a deal, it's fine. But there are hard deadlines because every landlord, you have to work on hard deadlines and you have to work on numbers.
Right.
So yes, but if you want to have an individual consultation, by all means, you can go to my website. There's a contact form and it's also linked in the newsletter.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Um, okay, so can you relocate a tenant and offer them the right of first refusal at market rent after rehab? So multiple things with this. You can't, depending on where you're at, you can't mandatory make a tenant move out. In many rent control jurisdictions, they don't let you do that on RSO units. So like, let's say if you're in LA City and you want to substantially remodel the unit, you got to pull permits. Then the permit process triggers what's called a tenant habitability plan, a THP. And it's during the tenant habitability plan is when the tenants get the paperwork about opting for permanent relocation. And they have basically two shots at the beginning, and then they have, I think, once the work starts, I think they have another shot at asking for permanent relocation. So you can't relocate them because you want to relocate them. If you want to substantially remodel, the chances are you're probably going to have to temporarily relocate them at your expense because they continue to pay their rent to you, but your accommodations for them are probably going to be more expensive. So what you typically do is a buyout, and you tell the tenants, I'm going to pay you to permanently move out. If you wanted to get them back at market rent, the problem is you haven't terminated the lease. So there's no termination and there's no consideration for the termination. So if you just go, hey, temporary, live somewhere else, then we'll sign a new lease and you will pay market rent, you're going to run into problems. And I can see them going to housing or an attorney and saying, hey, I was bamboozled and I shouldn't be paying more money. The buyout agreement is what's terminating their lease. If they want to apply for the unit again, once it's rehabbed and put on the market, okay. Completely understand that they're good tenants and you don't want to lose good tenants. That's what makes it kind of tricky in doing these. But you couldn't just relocate them without being required to do so, or them entering a voluntary move out agreement, a buyout, where you pay them to move out. Okay, so you have 3 units you want to buy out. Do we have them sign a non-disclosure so that they don't talk to each other while they're negotiating? It's hard to enforce that. They're all confidential. So when I send them out, it says it's confidential. But for the most part, it's like, how would you know that they're talking or not? You might have a feeling, but it would be hard to enforce that. And then it wouldn't really get you anywhere to stop them from talking. So what happens when you have buyouts and you want to do 3 units is kind of what I touched on a little bit earlier, which is you have a set budget. You approach the tenants, you say, this is what, is available. This is what I'm proposing to pay you to do this. And they will talk to each other, and they might come back and all give you the same offer, which could be crazy or it could be reasonable. And then that's where you really have to know how to negotiate and explain to them that, that's not in the budget and that's not feasible. But you've already seed planted. So you already have the idea in their head. And if they come forward, it's because they're interested. And you might have a tenant that just goes, no, I'm not interested. They don't like the number. You can try to double bid against yourself, but then it becomes sort of a guessing game. But in the instance of them three talking, I don't think you can really stop them from talking. And it doesn't really change anything for them because at the end of the day, they can't talk their way into your checkbook. So if you don't have the money, you don't feel comfortable paying that, it kind of ends there. And then they have to go back and figure out if they want to negotiate as a group still, or if they want to like save themselves and get themselves a deal. And it's always the first tenant that comes forward and gets an agreement signed tends to get the best deal. And then issue of non-permitted structure. So the non-permitted structure is kind of, it's the tricky one. They're, in theory, it's a good, it's not good. In theory, you're trying to do good by, having a unit for somebody. Maybe you lease it below market rent. Maybe, sorry, there's a spider. Maybe you, have a friend or a family member or an acquaintance that's like, hey, I lost my job. I need somewhere to live. I'm trying to get my life together. My experience in those scenarios is that people don't ever get their life together once they have really cheap rent. And then when it comes time to asking them, hey, my life is changing. I got to move into the unit. I got to sell the property. The unit's not legal. And all these things are coming out. It becomes very complicated. And you as a landlord are in a very bad spot in that scenario because you should have not rented it in the first place if it was not a permitted unit, if it's not a unit that has a C of O, it's not a unit that the city formally recognizes. And so buyouts are very common in that scenario. Depending on the tenant's personality, sometimes they're very mellow about it and they understand and they take the money and they go. And then sometimes they get very aggressive and demand a lot of money. And you're kind of stuck because you are in the situation where the unit's not legal and you can't technically evict them unless you have a government order requiring that. And then that's kind of a double-edged sword because then now if you self-report, you have this violation on record. So those are buyouts that I've done, but they are also the trickiest buyouts because if the tenant's very temperamental, they have you in a very bad position. Okay, I think I addressed everybody's questions. Does anybody have any other questions?
Sasha, I inherited units in the city of LA and they need work. In your experience, does the tenant usually accept the minimum relocation fee, or is it usually way above that?
It's a lot of factors. One, it depends where they are in the city. It depends how long they've been there. It depends on how old they are. And it depends on how rooted they are in it. A lot of tenants, like it goes almost by zip code. Like I know if you were to go buy out a unit in like South LA, you probably could get buyouts at relocation amounts. And that's typically what I get done in like South LA. But if you have an apartment in Silver Lake and you have very low paying rent tenant, they don't care if the thing's crumbling around them. They're paying, $1,000 for Silver Lake. Why would they leave? So it really depends on the tenant, kind of where they're at. And
they're in Boyle Heights.
Oh yeah, Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights is a mixed bag. It's changing a little bit, but in my opinion, I can't really like guess in a vacuum. The first step is really to just present the offer. And when tenants ask me, well, why does my landlord want me to leave? Why I'm a great tenant. I'm perfect. Like I'm God's gift to earth. And you're like, yeah, probably all those things, but it has nothing to do with you as a tenant. It's a numbers thing. My client would like to invest in rehabbing the unit, despite the fact the unit's habitable. They would like to rehab it and get market rent so that they can continue to afford owning the property, maintaining it. And tenants get that. Like they get it. They get it's a business decision. And so they understand that there's going to be a budget. And if it doesn't make sense for them to move at the relocation amount, I also understand that because it is expensive for them to move. And a lot of tenants are very fine living in the accommodations that they have and the condition that they're in. Tenants, a lot of tenants don't care that they've lived there for 30 years and they've had 30 years of wear and tear on a unit. But you can never really know until you start the process with them. And if they come back and they want an exorbitant amount of money, you don't have to necessarily give it to them. Maybe it pencils out for you, maybe it doesn't. But in my experience, as far as what amount tenants get, it's so hard to peg that because there's so many factors to it. It depends on their own life situation. I've had tenants who want to relocate out of state and they will take relocation and they're in a really good area. I've had tenants where they get an attorney and you have to negotiate, and I have no problem negotiating with an attorney. But I also tell my clients, hey, not every deal is possible. If you and the tenant are so far apart and it just doesn't make sense for both of you, it is what it is. You can't force them to do anything. You can't play games with them. You can't risk going to an eviction court for, an eviction that is very thin. But the first step is you've got to inquire with the tenant, and all you can do is ask. You assume they say no, but you'd be surprised. Maybe they would say yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's not a limit for buyouts because they're voluntary agreements. So they're, again, voluntary. There's sometimes minimums, but there's not a maximum. So I've seen, I've heard of buyouts for, $500,000 because it just made that much sense to the landlord to pay that. As far as the city abandoning mom and pop landlords, my answer to that is that mom and pop landlords have to be vocal about the things that are their problems, and landlords are not, because a lot of landlords that are mom and pops, which is the majority of the landlords, you guys have day jobs. You are maybe retired, maybe inherited something that your parents set up and you had nothing to do with it. It's in theory supposed to be passive. So a lot of landlords have been passive and a lot of tenants have been extremely loud. And so the loudest voice in the room tends to get their way. So if you really want things to change, you have to, 1, vote, and 2, show up. And AGLA, which I'm a member of, and I've done a webinar with them, they're vocal for landlords, but a lot of the times it's just them because landlords don't show up. So if you want change to happen, you have to write to city council. You have to show up to city council meetings. When there's things that they're proposing, the motions that they're setting forth that you think are negatively going to impact you as a property owner, you have to voice it and you have to voice why. And you have to do it nonstop. And tenants nonstop do it. And that's why tenants nonstop get their way. And that's why we have a lot of tenants on city council who nonstop push for tenants. So 1 has to do with voting, and 2, it has to do with showing up for yourself as a property owner in various meetings and writing to all your representatives on their proposed measures. I know that's not like the answer you wanted to hear, but that's kind of the reality. And it's bad. It's getting very bad for landlords. And I don't think that it will get much better until landlords push back in kind of what I think the same way that employers did with PAGA. If you're an employer and you're aware of the Private Attorney General Act, there was a ballot measure to repeal it, and employers and employee, basically attorneys got together and they hashed out a reform bill, which the governor signed. Because a lot of businesses were going bankrupt over these PAGA lawsuits. So you have to, in my opinion, things like that have to be brought forward, and landlords really have to band together. So if you have questions about ways that you can contribute, I definitely recommend reaching out to AGLA. They have a website. They have different initiatives. They file different lawsuits on behalf of landlords. And they have plenty of information on ways that you can get active, sign up for their newsletter, because sometimes they have email blasts where they tell you who to contact, how to contact them, and sometimes a draft letter on, what to say to city council members or, representatives. I will put in let me find the website for AGLA. I will find it for you. here is AGLA. So if you want to learn more about them, if you want to become a member, if you're not already, they do have a lot of forms for landlords. So they do template forms. They have a lot of webinars. They have a huge library of webinars. One of them is mine on Cash for Keys. And I'll be doing another one, which I cannot remember on the top of my head, but I believe it is next week. Sometime, yeah, next Thursday at, I believe, 10:45 a.m. I will be doing a webinar with AGLA on REAP, which is the, oh my God, why can't I think of the acronym? It's, if you're a landlord in LA City, you know, it's like landlord jail. It's if your property goes into disrepair far enough and long enough, then it's a program where the city basically starts collecting your rent and cuts people's rent in half. So we'll be doing a presentation on REAP, what it is, how to avoid getting into it. And if you're in it, you know, how to address it. But very good, like preventative information if you are a landowner or property owner, landlord in LA City, or just in general. Okay, do we have any more questions before I close this out? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you showing up. I hope that this presentation was helpful. Like I said, I will upload it to YouTube. I will link it in my newsletter. If you're not already on my newsletter, highly recommend that you subscribe to it. I give updates on news, whether it's national, state, local, about property, real estate, landlords. I do post videos. Some of them are informative. Some of them are mildly entertaining, which are my reaction videos. And so also suggest you go to YouTube where I have some videos, also some on Cash for Keys. So with that, I'm going to close this out. And again, thank everybody for your time. And I hope this was worthwhile. And I will see you maybe in the next one. Bye, everybody. Okay, now I got to figure out how to end it.